Thank you, Hans. We had a lot of really interesting stuff this morning, and especially new products that had not been presented yet in the context of the project. So, unfortunately, ZEF's involvement in work package 3 are mostly about things that had already been presented. So I will be brief on that, just to give a little bit of recap and maybe a few things that we have tried to improve or change, and then focus on the one new piece, at least to most of you here, I think, which is the meta-analysis of the impacts of GM crops. And then I'll give the floor to the other two presenters, Derek and Michel, who have new material to share with you. So this is the different topics that we're going to address this afternoon. As Hans said, I'll talk a little bit about this typology of innovations and impact channels. There was 2 products that we had put out under this piece of work, which was the innovation database, which is an evolving database, and a literature review on impact channels of innovation on food and nutrition security. There's one piece of work that I won't present today, or I will just say a couple of brief words about it, and that's the one on GM crops institutional requirements to realize the benefits of GM crops, because one of the authors of this study from LIE will be here on Friday morning, and this piece of work will be discussed at length in that session on Friday morning. So rather than me talk about it, I'll let him do it on Friday. I would just say a couple of words on what actually they're trying to do there. I think this the question that they pose, assuming that GM crops can improve food and nutrition security, is what is institutionally required for these benefits to be realized. And they look at 4 different areas there: food safety and environmental regulation. They look at IPRs and access of farmers to specific products, the entrepreneurships of farmers in developing countries, and the way that this entices them or not to take these new technologies on board, and the 4th element that they address, which is the one that was most emphasized in the proposal phase of FOODSECURE, and that has to do with public debate, the ethics of GM crops, and consumer acceptance of the technology. So that's just to give you a bit of appetite for the session on Friday morning. So just really 2 slides or 3 slides on the previous work that we had presented already, and the use that will be made of it in the project. The literature review on the impacts of technology on food and nutrition security led to 2 pieces of work, as I said, the database and sort of the literature review on impact channels. The typology is really coming out of these 2 exercises. As we did the literature review, we were working on the databases. As we were trying to categorize innovations in different ways, we were sort of adapting the typology. As I said, this is an ongoing work, and one of my assistants is now trying to update the database with new innovations, but also we want to redefine or refine some of the categories that we had in there. Especially, we were mostly describing the types of innovations as very bluntly institutional innovations and technological innovations, and we found out that basically all the different programs that we were reviewing and including in that database are usually packages of different innovations. So you always have, well, it's a typology that makes no sense because they're all a mix of institutional and technological innovation. So we try to refine this into further categories, and to especially look what type of innovations are bundled together in a program, and where they take place. I think that's something that when we presented this work to different stakeholders, this was something that sparked the interest. They wanted to know how they combine and where. So we are also trying to link this to a mapping exercise. And the database looks like this. As I said, type of innovation. At the moment, we're trying to refine this in about 11 or 12 different categories against these two original categories that we had. It's an access database, so it's very easy to use. And the main question then with this database and this typology work is why are we doing this? I think that work didn't lead to the results that maybe were expected at the beginning, in the sense that it would be something that is readily usable by the different modeling teams. But definitely in our minds, this is work that is necessary for the further work at ZEF, looking at science policy and the qualitative description of where innovations take place, what kind of science system is behind them, etc., in order to lead to this report that is identified in Work Package 9 and to be produced on priority setting for investments in science for food and nutrition security. So that's just a very quick refresher on what we had produced there. The second piece that was coming somehow attached to this literature review was a stakeholder survey on different views, diverging views on impacts of types of innovations on food and nutrition security and their relevance to food and nutrition security in developing countries. That was a mandated output of the project that had been slipped into the proposal, and which we had to obviously comply with. So we did this online survey. You can see here the distribution of the respondents, and the main idea was to capture views of stakeholders which were not always included in scientific studies, in this case NGOs in particular. So they were represented there, and you will see from just the one slide of results, which I will show, but again we had shown this already, that this leads to results that maybe are of very different nature than to the impact assessments that we see in scientific literature. So there you go. That's one of the diagrams that we can draw from that stakeholder survey, where we asked the respondents, the stakeholders, in your opinion, are the following types of innovations relevant to improving food and nutrition security in developing countries? And I mean, the red basically means irrelevant, yeah, and the purple means highly relevant. And you can see there that, can I aim? Yes. GM crops, that's innovation L, were deemed as the most irrelevant innovation for food and nutrition security in developing countries. As I said, this is a non-representative group of stakeholders. This was really trying to portray a specific view. Yeah? On the other hand, you can see that all innovations here, which have to do with education of farmers, so farmer extension, bringing the right information to the farmers, yeah, are deemed as the most relevant innovations. The reasons we didn't just ask that question. We tried to. We were expecting that we would get very controversial results from asking a question like this. We wanted to make sure that this was somehow substantiated. So we asked other questions to cross-check if they were ranking these priorities the same way across all the questions, which was actually very consistent. The main reasons that were actually cited for this rejection, if you want, of GM crops was economic sustainability in the case of developing countries, and their applicability or the range of their potential application beyond experimental setting. All right, so now to the new piece, which I had not presented yet, and you can see that mostly the main study here, I'm not part of the authors, so this is work that we had commissioned to a colleague of ours in Germany who's a big expert on GM crops, so Martin Keim, and he did that work with one of his colleagues, Wilhelm Kluge. And then we tried to take up their work and extend it a little bit in a way that it would cover all the bases under the FOODSECURE contract. So what is the study here coming up with? Well, first it's already published, so it's free access, +1, so everybody can download it. This is a quantitative meta-analysis of 147 studies, which they screen from a very large pool of studies looking at GM impacts. And the number of observations depends based on the type of crop you're looking at and the type of impact that you want to investigate. So the maximum number of observations they have is 451, but you will see from the result table that for some of the impacts they have much smaller numbers, much smaller number of observations. What's the contribution of their study? Because of course there had already been other meta-analysis of the impacts of GM crops, where they extended the geographical coverage, they extended the number of outcome variables, so they looked into yield impacts, they looked into impact on pesticide quantity, on pesticide costs, on total production costs, and on farm profits. So they extended that's an extended set of outcome variables from existing work, and also the type of method that they use. As I say, they don't look just at average impacts, but they also use meta-regressions, which allows them to look into where differences in these average impacts might be coming from. The data is covering herbicide-tolerant cotton, maize, and soybean, as well as insect-resistant maize and cotton. So this is the main table of results they have in their paper. So these are percentage change mean impacts. Yeah, so you can see that if you look at all GM crops together, yield impact is plus 21%. Pesticide quantity, I don't report all the outcome variables here, only the ones that make the most sense in the case of the FOODSECURE contract. Decreased use of pesticide, minus 37%, and a very strong impact on farmer profits, and this is net profits, yeah. Plus 68%. You can see that the impact is a little bit differentiated when you look at the type of crop, but that's quite natural. Herbicide-tolerant crops are not constructed or devised so that it decreases the quantity of pesticide you might use. And actually you find, but it's not significant, that the impact is actually an increase there. But still you can see the impact on yields is much stronger for insect-resistant crops than for herbicide-tolerant crops. Impact on profits is strongly significant in the case of insect-resistant crops, but not significant in the case of herbicide-tolerant crops. As I said also, that there's a strong difference in the number of observations there, so these significance issues are definitely coming from a data availability issue. Oops. So if you look down there, they have only 17 observations coming from 9 different studies, yeah, compared to these impacts here where you have a large number of observations and studies. As I said, they also look into the reasons behind the heterogeneity behind these impacts. And so I tried to explain some of the drivers of the heterogeneity. They, for instance, find a significant impact of whether the study has taken place in a developing country or in an industrialized country. The impact on the farm profits are completely different there.
try to look at the type of data, if that has an impact on the soil, if that impacts the impact evaluation. So whether you have field trials or lab experiments, etc., etc. And as I said, there's a big difference between the impact of insect resistance, the treat, which as a dummy on yields is quite strong, and even stronger on pesticide quantity, which comes out of, I would say, by definition from the purpose of the treat. It was mentioned in the contract that we should look carefully into environmental impacts and health impacts, which was something that is only partly addressed by the study by Klümper and Keim, with this reduction in pesticide quantity that can be used as a proxy for environmental impact. So we did a literature review there of all studies on these, of many studies on these impacts. There are already existing literature reviews on these impacts. One of them actually co-authored by David in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. So in the first part of the review, we looked at reviews, and we tried to draw the different common elements across all these reviews. And then in the second part of this little note that we put together, we looked at studies that analyze specific impacts and tried to categorize this in a number of different type of impacts. The reason why we did the first part of the study is basically different reviews were not touching on all possible impacts and not covering all environmental system or ecological zones. So we thought if we cover the different review pieces, then we cover all bases. And then the reason why we did the second part is because we wanted to get a bit deeper sort of insight into what impacts is actually meant when one of these review pieces says something like GM impacts have no GM have no impacts on the diversity of soil microfauna. What does that mean? Yeah. I just have this last slide on the sort of salient features of this review. Perceived negative impacts mostly boil down to the issue of gene transfer, impact on non-target organisms, and on soil ecology. In the case of health impacts, it has to do a lot with the potential toxicity of GM crops, and especially this issue of whether they can lead to allergic reactions. All these impacts are really rather comprehensively addressed in the literature. But of course remains the question, do we know of all potential impacts? And is there not too strong a weight on looking at impacts which are recommended to investigate in environmental impact assessments or risk assessments as dictated by food safety guidelines in different countries? There's also, in that case, the challenge of new GM crops coming up with several treats, and how to evaluate this. The current consensus or the current push is to say, well, we keep analyzing the risks based on each treat rather than on the combination of them. But some people argue that actually there might be additional effects by combining different treats. So what are the bottom lines of these different reviews that we looked at, or impact assessment that we looked at? Environmental assessments
clearly point to the fact that local contexts are very important and that time series should be used, which is not always the case. So that sort of discards a number of impact assessment studies. Not all negative impacts can be rejected. There are, for instance, most studies pointing to a negative impact on the microbes that are living on the roots of GM crops. But what we didn't see much are looking at these impacts in relative terms, so relative to other technologies. And in terms of health, basically, no commercialized GM crops have been reported or have shown any negative health impacts. And potential allergic reactions in some GM products, these studies basically led to the rejection of these products, and they've never reached the consumers. Okay, so that's all for GM crops.